somewhere in the Swiss Alps. Vaults opened quietly. Gold bars slid inside. No questions asked. But here is what nobody wanted you to know. That gold had a history. It had names attached to it. Wedding rings. Dental fillings. Family heirlooms. It came from people who were murdered for it. And the bankers in Zurich and Bern? They knew. Picture Switzerland in 1943. Pristine streets. Orderly cities. Quiet cafes. A country at peace, surrounded entirely by war. Just a few hours' drive from those clean Swiss boulevards, cattle trains were rolling across Europe, packed beyond capacity. Men, women, children. Dazed, terrified, stepping over bodies before they even reached the platform. Families like the Silags and the Harastis, ordinary people pulled from their homes, were arriving at a place called Auschwitz. They had no idea what waited for them. A sign above the entrance read, "Baths." There were flower borders along the lawns. An orchestra played. Light music. Reassuring tunes. The kind of melody designed to keep people calm. Keep them walking forward. Into the chambers. And while that was happening, just hours away, Swiss bankers were sending telegrams. Balancing ledgers. Asking no questions about where the gold was coming from. This is the story they buried for decades. The story of how an entire continent was systematically looted. And how that stolen wealth found a warm, willing home. In the most neutral country on earth. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to understand one thing about the Nazi regime. They were not just killers. They were thieves. Organized, obsessive, bureaucratic thieves. From the very first day they occupied a new country. Before the shootings, before the deportations. The looting began. When German forces invaded Poland in 1939, Reichsmarshal Göring didn't wait a single day. He ordered the seizure of the country's art. Within 6 months, Poland had been stripped of almost its entire artistic heritage. Paintings, sculptures, centuries of culture, gone. But France? France offered far greater treasures. Göring, who fancied himself a connoisseur of fine art, wanted everything. Alfred Rosenberg, later hanged at Nuremberg as a war criminal, was given command of a special unit. Its mission, to systematically plunder France's museums, chateaux, and galleries, including the Louvre itself. Göring issued a secret order in November 1940, dividing whatever was taken into 3 categories. Artworks reserved for Hitler's personal use. Pieces to complete Göring's own private collection. And everything else, sent to German museums. Removing a painting from a museum wall was relatively simple. What came next was far darker. Because the real prize wasn't hanging on gallery walls. The real prize was in people's homes. In their pockets. In their mouths. The Nazi obsession with gold became something almost pathological. In the occupied territories, special units called commandos were deployed to extermination camps. Their job? Sort through the belongings of every person who arrived on the trains. These were inmates given a horrific privilege. The privilege of surviving long enough to process the possessions of those who had just been killed. Jewelry. Foreign currency. Antiques. Family photographs. Everything sorted, catalogued, sent to Berlin. Gold items were especially valued. They could be melted down into bars. But the worst task, the one that fell to the Sonderkommandos, came after the gas chambers had done their work. Half an hour after the Zyklon B had cleared. These inmates, dressed in rubber boots and gas masks, would enter the chamber. And they would search the dead. 4 gold fillings. 4 silver dental work. Every last trace of extractable value, harvested from the bodies of murdered human beings. And those fillings were sent to the Reichsbank in Berlin, to be melted down at the mint. Now think about that for a moment. This wasn't a side operation. This wasn't rogue behavior by a few criminals. This was policy. Documented. Managed. Audited. The efficiency that Germany was famous for, applied to genocide. And it wasn't just the dead they targeted. In the city of Oradea in Romania, a place the Hungarian-speaking community knew as Nagyvarad, the looting began before the deportations. A special SS unit called the Devisenschutskommando, the DSK, arrived in cities across occupied Western Europe with a specific mission. Officially, they were there to monitor currency flows. In reality, their purpose, as one Allied intelligence report later described it, was simple. The acquisition of gold by any means, including deceit and brutality. The DSK used fake property listings as traps. They would advertise homes or land for sale, targeting anyone known to have liquid assets. When a buyer showed up, someone with gold or cash, they were arrested, tortured, until they revealed everything. The intelligence report on the DSK lists some of the unit's officers. One preferred to break a beer glass over a victim's head. Another employed burning matches on bare skin. A third, more methodical, used electric shock. These were not soldiers. They were bureaucratic predators. And in Paris, they operated out of a comfortable office on Rue Pilotville. To understand what the looting looked like at ground level, you need to meet one man. His name was Alexander Leitner. He was the civil leader of the Jewish community in Oradea, and he survived. After the war, from the safety of Switzerland, where he eventually escaped on a secret train, he wrote down everything he witnessed. He called it the tragedy of the Jews in Najivarad. It is one of the most important eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust's financial machinery, and it begins in the spring of 1944. On the 5th of April 1944, shortly after Germany occupied Hungary, yellow stars appeared on Jewish homes across Oradea. Leitner wrote in his diary, "First day of the Jew badge, the yellow star. The days of the darkest Middle Ages have come back." What followed was not random chaos. It was organized terror. Government officials arrived from Budapest to supervise the looting personally. Financial clerks tallied the stolen assets in real time. By the 18th of May, the total haul from Oradea's Jewish community had already reached 30 million, and it was still climbing. One of the visiting officials wrote back proudly to his superiors, "The booty gained out of Jewish assets grows successfully." This was not shame. This was a progress report. The method for extracting wealth from individuals was chillingly systematic. Jews were brought in for interrogation, often dragged from their beds before dawn. They were asked one question over and over: "Where have you hidden your gold?" Most had nothing to hide. The propaganda that Jewish families were sitting on mountains of secret wealth was a lie. But the interrogators, conditioned by decades of institutional antisemitism, refused to believe any denial. And so the beatings began. When beatings failed to produce confessions, the electric shock machine was brought in. Leitner describes one victim who confided in him afterward. The man had given a few valuables to a Christian neighbor for safekeeping, a common and dangerous act of trust. Under torture, he broke. He told them everything. And afterward, half-broken, barely coherent, he said to Leitner, "My brain turns out, my heart leaps into my throat. I have confessed all. It vexes me now that my honorable Christian friend will have uneasiness. He was so trustful and I betrayed him." That is the depth of what this system did. It didn't just steal gold. It tore apart trust. It weaponized human connection. But here is the moment that stops you cold. On the 12th of May, Leitner looked out from the courtyard where he was being held. An old man shuffled toward him. Face swollen. Hands red and puffed. Walking with a limp. It was his father. The elder Leitner had just been beaten for information about wealth he did not possess. Father and son embraced. The old man lay down on his son's cot. Minutes later, the gendarme returned. He asked if the elder Leitner's wife lived with him. She did. And so she was taken to the electric shock machine as well. When she returned, somehow with no visible marks, she told her son what had happened. She had told them repeatedly she knew nothing about any hidden fortune. Afterward, the gendarme drove her back to their family home to search for non-existent buried gold. When she showed him the paved courtyard, fully asphalted with nowhere to dig, he drew his revolver. He threatened to shoot her in the street unless she showed him where the gold was buried. She stood her ground. She told him to dig up the asphalt if he wanted to. Eventually, she said, he became so furious, so consumed by the impossibility of finding something that didn't exist, that he simply gave up. "That is impossible," he finally admitted. "Here is nothing digged." She survived that day. But the story was not over. Most of the Jews of Oradea, including Leitner's own family members, were eventually loaded onto cattle trains. Destination Auschwitz. A few survived. Most did not. Now multiply that story. Not by hundreds, not by thousands, by millions, across Poland, France, Holland, Belgium, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia. The same machinery, the same obsession with gold, the same brutal efficiency. The Third Reich eventually extracted the equivalent of over 100 billion Reichsmarks from its occupied territories. Holland alone was forced to pay the equivalent of $4 million as a so-called war contribution. Göring's art looting, the DSK's torture operations, the Sonderkommandos harvesting fillings from the dead, all of it feeding the same machine. All of it being converted into one thing: gold bars, stamped with the insignia of the Reichsbank, and sent west, to Switzerland. This is the part of the story that was buried the longest. It's the part that powerful people spent decades trying to keep quiet. While all of this was happening, while the camps ran and the trains rolled and the gold was harvested, the Swiss National Bank was open for business. Every week, gold bars arrived from Berlin. Mit stamp. Official. Reichsbank officials sent telegrams to their counterparts in Bern. Funds were transferred. Credits were issued. No one asked where the gold had come from. Or at least, no one asked out loud. Because here is what we now know. Swiss government officials were informed of the nature of the Nazi genocide from its earliest stages. Swiss army doctors had served on the Eastern Front, invited by the German military to treat wounded soldiers during Operation Barbarossa. They witnessed the aftermath of mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads that operated ahead of the main German advance. They reported back to the Red Cross. They reported back to the Swiss government. And the Swiss National Bank's own internal legal records, covering the period from 1943 to 1950, explicitly mentioned the deportations and persecution of Jews. This was documented. This was known. And yet, business continued as usual. In fact, it was Swiss telegraph machines that clattered out some of the first confirmed reports about the systematic extermination of European Jews. On the 8th of August, 1942, a telegram left Geneva. It was sent by Gerhard Riegner, the World Jewish Congress representative in Switzerland, to officials in London and New York. The message warned that Nazi leadership was actively planning the complete elimination of European Jewry. 3.5 to 4 million people. The method under consideration, prussic acid. The source, a Leipzig businessman named Eduard Schulte, who had connections reaching into the highest levels of the German command, was considered reliable. The information had traveled through a Swiss intermediary. Then to a Jewish journalist in Switzerland. Then to Riegner. And from Switzerland, to the world. After months of debate about whether to believe it, Rabbi Stephen Wise finally broke the story publicly on the 24th of November, 1942. After that, as Leitner himself later observed, even the bankers of Zurich could not claim they didn't know about the Holocaust. And yet, the gold kept coming. The Swiss National Bank's own internal report, written in 1984, decades after the war, admitted plainly that its officials had not been sufficiently suspicious about where the German gold shipments were originating. The report put it with brutal clarity. It is hard to understand that, even in 1944, the governing board of the SNB still trusted the criminal Nazi regime. But trust wasn't really the operative word. The operative word was profit. Because what the Swiss banks were providing wasn't just storage. They were providing something the Nazi war machine desperately needed. Foreign currency. Germany was at war with most of the world. It couldn't buy tungsten for fighter planes directly with Reichsmarks. It couldn't purchase steel for panzer tanks from Spain or Portugal in German currency. It needed neutral intermediaries. It needed convertible money. And the Swiss banks provided exactly that. The gold, looted from Jewish families, melted from dental fillings, seized from national treasuries across occupied Europe, was converted through Swiss institutions into Portuguese escudos, Spanish pesetas and American dollars. Those currencies then flowed back to fund everything from Wehrmacht salaries to SS operations. Swiss banks were not passive recipients. They were the financial engine that kept the Nazi war machine running. Inside the Reichsbank, a specific system was developed to process the flood of looted valuables arriving from the death camps. It was called the Mellmehr system. Named after an SS officer called Bruno Mellmehr, though in the official paperwork no such name appeared. Instead, the account receiving all the looted goods was registered under the name Max Heiliger. Max Heiliger was not a person. Max Heiliger was a fiction. A blank name on a ledger, designed to obscure the true identity of the account holder. The SS itself. Here is how it worked. SS units across occupied Europe collected valuables, jewelry, coins, watches, precious stones, dental gold, and sent them in truckloads to the Reichsbank in Berlin. Each delivery was marked with a single code word, Mellmehr. Reichsbank officials, including Albert Toms, chief of the Precious Metals Department, would assess the value of each shipment and credit the appropriate amount to the Max Heiliger account. A letter from the Reichsbank to the Berlin Municipal Pawnshop, sent in mid-September, lists one routine delivery. 154 gold watches. 1,601 gold earrings. 132 diamond rings. 784 silver pocket watches. And, chillingly, 160 partial dentures, some of gold. This wasn't a one-time shipment. This was a regular operation. Toms, captured and interrogated by Allied forces after the war, later admitted that containers arriving from the camps were sometimes stamped with the word Konzentrationslager, concentration camp. He claimed not to have understood the significance. Allied investigators did not find that credible, because by his own admission, Toms knew the Berlin pawnshop was regularly selling smelted dental gold, and dental gold does not smelt itself. The revenue generated by the Melmer system went into the Max Heiliger account. Allied intelligence later concluded that much of that money flowed directly to one man, Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS, the engineer of the final solution, personal beneficiary of an industrial-scale looting operation built on the bodies of millions of murdered people. When Allied forces liberated Auschwitz, and then swept through Germany in the spring of 1945, they found the evidence everywhere. In Merkers, Germany, soldiers discovered an abandoned salt mine. Inside, a mountain of hidden Nazi treasure that officials had not managed to melt down or ship to Switzerland. Allied troops found 189 separate containers, carefully piled in a corner of the cave, labeled with the sender's name, the Reichsbank in Berlin, and a package number. When they opened them, they found what one official Allied report, stamped secret, and dated May 1945, described as every conceivable kind of personal article of value and considerable currency, ornamental silver, flatware, Passover cups, watch chains, cigarette cases, some with names engraved, some with names scratched out, opera glasses, spectacle frames, rings, wedding rings, engagement rings, anniversary rings, pearl necklaces, diamond bracelets, silk stockings, the last possessions of entire communities, eradicated. This was not the wealth of national treasuries. This was not the output of some abstract financial operation. This was the archaeology of genocide. Each item had once sat in a drawer somewhere, had been clasped around a wrist on a wedding day, had been worn to a child's school graduation, had been slipped into a coat pocket on the last morning someone left their home alive. After the war, Dwight Eisenhower himself, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, sent a top-secret cipher telegram to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dated May 6, 1945. It detailed the full scope of looted Nazi gold discovered across Germany, branch by branch, vault by vault. In Halle, 64 gold bars, plus individual safe deposit contents, traced back to the DSK operation in Paris. In Nuremberg, bags and chests of gold bars confirmed as originating from a Dutch bank in Amsterdam. In Magdeburg, 6,000 silver bars belonging to the National Bank of Hungary, alongside 12 bags from the Reichsbank's precious metals department, the very department that had overseen the smelting of jewelry and teeth from Holocaust victims. In Plauen, the accounts turned out to belong to Heinrich Himmler himself. 250,000 US gold dollars, 1 million Swiss gold francs, 98,450 Dutch guilders, 151,560 Norwegian kroner, all deposited by the SS Security Service, for the personal account of the SS Reichsfuhrer. And in Hof, investigators found a church gold chalice, dated 1722, deposited by Richard Wendler, the commander of the Lublin concentration camp. Private booty stored in a church. 23 crates of gold and silverware nearby, and valuable cloths and rugs. When all of this came to light, fully, publicly, undeniably, the question turned to Switzerland. The international scandal that erupted in 1996 over Holocaust victims' dormant bank accounts pulled the curtain back. Suddenly, documents that had sat quietly in British and American archives for 50 years became headlines. What they revealed was a pattern far deeper than unclaimed savings accounts. The Swiss National Bank had accepted gold it had every reason to know was looted. Private Swiss banks had served as the critical foreign currency providers for the Nazi war machine. And the escudos and dollars and pesetas that flowed through Swiss institutions had paid for steel and tungsten and fuel, the physical materials of a war that killed tens of millions of people. Holocaust victims' dormant accounts were, as one Swiss banking chairman somewhat infamously described them, peanuts. The true scale of Swiss collaboration was something far larger. There is a postscript that deserves to be spoken aloud. After the war ended, Allied finance officers faced a strange and grim problem. They were trying to calculate reparations. They needed to assess the quality of the gold bars recovered across Germany. But dental gold, gold smelted from the fillings of murdered people, is of lower purity than standard monetary gold. It creates a classification problem. A letter from a U.S. embassy official in Paris, dated July 1946, noted the issue plainly. A shipment of 8,307 gold bars, packed in 4,173 bags, had been flagged with a question mark. Because after proper analysis, those bars might be classified as melted down teeth fillings and therefore classifiable as non-monetary gold. Non-monetary gold. That was the bureaucratic phrase for it. For the fillings of 8,000 people. History has a way of making the monstrous seem distant. Of reducing horror to statistics. But statistics are just people with the humanity edited out. Behind every gold bar in those Swiss vaults, there was a name. A family. A life that was lived and then taken. Behind every entry in the Reichsbank's ledger, there was a morning someone got up and made coffee. A night someone tucked their child into bed. A Saturday afternoon when a couple exchanged rings. The Nazis understood something deeply sinister. That if you could strip a people of their wealth first, you stripped them of their dignity. And if you stripped them of their dignity, you made everything else easier. But the Nazis did not act alone. They needed willing hands to hold the ledgers. They needed institutions prepared to accept delivery without asking questions. They needed countries willing to stay neutral. In the face of crimes that demanded a response. Neutrality is often presented as a virtue. But there are moments in history when neutrality is simply another word for complicity. Switzerland was not the only country to look away. It was simply the most profitable one. Alexander Leitner's mother, the 77-year-old woman who stood in a paved courtyard with a revolver pointed at her chest and refused to confess to a crime she had not committed, survived the war. Her defiance, in that single moment, was an act of extraordinary courage. The world she returned to was one that had largely moved on. The bankers were still banking. The vaults were still full. And for 50 years the question of where all that gold had come from remained politely unanswered. It took another generation, and a scandal that could no longer be contained, before the world finally demanded the truth. The truth was always there. It was just buried under 50 years of silence. And a great deal of someone else's gold.